So welcome to our program with Bill the Baker. We're really pleased to host this program tonight. I'm Ross Topolsky with the Vernon Area Public Library, and I'd like to introduce you to our guest, Bill Reichman, otherwise known as Bill the Baker. Bill has been baking bread for almost 50 years. His passion is teaching others about the art and science of baking. And Bill, welcome to our webinar.
Thank you, Ross. And thank you everybody for attending, and welcome to my kitchen. Just to get started on the right foot, let me explain who I am and how I ended up here in front of you tonight. I was never a professional baker during my working career. My whole working career revolved around computers, but I always baked during my adult life, and I had a passion for baking breads. And when I retired, I decided I would share that passion with everybody that I could share it with. And I started teaching at local cooking schools here in Chicago, as well as one in Newport, Rhode Island, which sounds kind of strange. But my wife and I have two sons, and one of them lives in Newport, and there was a cooking school there that entertained visiting instructors. And when I would go to Newport, I would let them know in advance that I was coming in, and they would set up a class for me to teach. So I truly love teaching. But when COVID hit, of course, I had to stop the in-person classes, and I switched over to the Zoom environment. When COVID first hit and everybody was asked to stay home, I decided to do a free class for children. My first class, I believe, had 8 students in it that started an absolute avalanche. I ended up with just under 200 families registering for classes in 7 different countries. And I did 190 free classes during the COVID shutdown. When the parents were being asked to go back to work, I had to switch away from the free classes because one of the requirements is an adult had to be in the kitchen with the children. And I started to do fee-based classes. So I now offer baking classes. And it's more than bread, but bread is my sweet spot. And you can find out more about my classes and about me and about my recipes at billthebaker.com. If you go to billthebaker.com after this session tonight, you can pull down any recipes that are there. If you don't see a recipe that you would like to have, you can contact me through the website, or you can contact me through B as in Bill Reichman, REICHMAN at sbcglobal.net. My philosophy on recipes is you are welcome to anything I have. If you feel confident that you can bake it, then you're more than welcome to try it. You don't have to attend one of my classes to get the recipe. For tonight's session, we're going to go very quickly through bagels. If you were to take an actual bagel class with me, it's a 2-day class. It's 2 days because the bagel dough requires an overnight fermentation. So the bagel dough that we're going to use tonight was actually mixed yesterday. But I'm going to show you how to mix a new batch of bagel dough. Then I'm going to show you how to pre-shape and then shape the bagel dough that was made yesterday. There will be a 20-minute pause while those bagels rise. We can take your questions then. And if we don't have questions, I can talk more about the science of baking. If you decide you do not want to hear about the science of baking, I will show you how to make a very delicious vegetable cream cheese spread. If we do not have time to show you how to make that spread during the class, for those of you that want to hang around for 5 minutes after the class, I'll be more than happy to show you how to make that cream cheese spread. It is truly a delicious cream cheese spread. It's a vegetable cream cheese spread. In tonight's class, we're going to make the plain bagel dough. And from that plain bagel dough, you can make a plain bagel, an Asiago bagel, a Parmesan bagel, poppy seed bagel, sesame seed bagel, onion bagel, everything bagel, cinnamon sugar bagel. You could use that same dough and make a cinnamon raisin bagel, but you have to do that on the day you mix the dough, which was yesterday. And as Roz said, I also have a recipe for pumpkin bagels. I have a pumpkin cream cheese spread. And I also have a pumpernickel bagel. And I believe somebody said they like chocolate chip. And that is the recipe that I challenged myself with this summer. I've made it 3 times. I'm not happy with it yet, but I'm getting very close. So if you watch my website and I finally get that recipe published, you're welcome to that one as well. So let's get started with the mixing of the dough. As Roz explained to you, I teach science. I don't teach recipes. I use the recipes to teach science. And in all of my classes, I try to teach good habits. And one of the habits that you should get used to is measuring everything out before you start to make something. I'm going to switch my camera so you can see my workspace. So I have all of my ingredients pre-measured. I also teach you that before you start mixing, you should count the ingredients in front of you. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And if you were to look at my recipe, which I understand you don't have yet, there are 5 ingredients on the recipe. So I know I'm getting off to a good start as long as I measured my ingredients accurately and I measured the correct ingredients. Accuracy is really improved if you use a scale. You'll see that your baking will improve immensely if you start measuring your ingredients with a scale. And the reason for that is there's so much chemistry involved in baking that baking is truly a science. And as long as you respect that science and measure everything accurately, you can count on the recipe working every time, provided you've used correct ingredients that have not gone out of date. But let's look at the ingredients that we're using tonight. I have bread flour. We'll talk about what bread flour is after we mix it. I have a product called diastatic malt powder. We will explain what that's used for. It's not for flavor. I have some instant yeast. Instant yeast means I can mix it directly into the flour and not proof it in water before. And I have some salt, and I have some water that's 95 degrees, between 95 and 100. So when it comes to assembling all of this, I'm going to put in the diastatic malt powder first, and then I'm going to whisk it. I don't really care which one goes in first. I only care that you whisk the ingredients each time you add something. I just added the salt. Now I'm going to add the instant yeast. Now I'm going to add the water. And I'm going to look around my workspace and make sure that all of the containers that I've measured things out in are now empty. So I know that I have incorporated everything into this dough that was intended to be there. I just put the dough hook on, and I'm going to start the mixer up. And I'm going to mix it until just the ingredients come together. And I'll show you what that looks like once I get the mixer started. I'm putting the mixer on speed 1. On my mixer, that doesn't say 1, it says stir, S-T-I-R. I'm going to mix it until all the ingredients come together. So you can see that I have a lot of dry ingredients in there right now. I still have a lot of dry ingredients. There's still a fair amount of dry ingredients on the bottom of the bowl, so I'm going to let it keep Try to keep running. I really want this to come together. Getting closer. Just remember, you have to be patient. Almost done. Okay, I've turned it off. There are no more dry ingredients in the bottom of the mixer. What I'm going to do next, I'm going to clean off this dough hook. I'm going to put a clean dish towel over the bowl. And I'm going to set a timer for 5 minutes. And now we can talk a little bit about what just happened, why we're letting it rest, and we'll talk a little bit about the bread flour. One of the questions that comes up in class all the time is what's the difference between bread flour, all-purpose flour, and some of the other flours that are available in our grocery stores. In order to answer that question, you have to look at the ingredients of a bag of wheat flour under a microscope. And if you were to do that, first of all, you have to understand that bread flour, all-purpose flour, cake flour, and pastry flour are all products that are made with wheat. And if you were to look at that white powder under a microscope, you would see that there's basically two components to that bag of flour. The majority of the bag is made up of starch, and there is a small percentage of the bag that's made up of proteins. I'm going to show you a bag of King Arthur flour, and I'll show you the front of the bag. This happens to be King Arthur bread flour. And if you look at the front of the bag right here, it says 12.7%. What that represents is 12.7% of this bag is protein, and the remaining is starch. If you would look at King Arthur all-purpose flour, you would see that 11.2% of the bag is protein, not 12.7. And if you looked at cake flour and pastry flour, you would see lower percentages in those bags as well. So what's the big deal about the amount of protein, and why is it a big deal between 11.2 and 12.7? You have to know that protein, there's two proteins that are all the same in all four of those bags. They're called gliadin and glutenin, not gluten, but glutenin. And those two proteins, when they get wet and you force them to bump into each other, end to end on the glutenin proteins, when those glutenin proteins hit each other end to end and they're wet, they form a very strong bond, and you end up with long strings of glutenin proteins. The sides do stick together, but not as tight as the ends. But as those strings start forming and they start bonding, they overlap, they're trapping, in that web, they are trapping the gliadin proteins, which look like little tiny beads. And together that mass represents something called gluten. So I want you to think for a second what it's like to chew on a piece of Italian bread. I'm guessing that most of you chew on it multiple times before you swallow it. And then think about a piece of cake and how many times you actually chew a piece of cake. In reality, it's probably once, unless it's heavily frosted. And the difference between the chewing on a piece of cake and the chewing on a piece of Italian bread is gluten. It's how much gluten you are chewing on, because it's gluten that you chew on primarily when you eat Italian bread. So the difference between 12.7, 11.2, and something down in the 9, 10% range, those percentages don't seem like a big difference. But when you think about chewing on a piece of cake versus chewing on a piece of Italian bread, it's a remarkable difference. And it's all because of the gluten. And if you use the correct flour, meaning if the recipe calls for bread flour, use the bread flour, you will end up with a product that has the correct texture. I don't think anybody wants to make a loaf of Italian bread that has the texture of cake. You could do it. It would be difficult. You could do it, but it really wouldn't be a very good product. So you should always use the correct ingredients when you bake. Why did we put a 5-minute timer on after we mixed this dough? That goes back to the mid-1970s. There was a professor in France. He was trying to improve the quality of the bread that his country was making. He felt the quality was going downhill because of mechanization being brought into the process. So he set out trying to improve the quality of the bread. One of the things that he discovered, he was a professor, but he was also an expert on bread making. One of the things he discovered was that if he mixed the flour and the water and let it rest, and then kneaded the dough after a rest period, which he called auto-leasing, sounds just like us leasing a car, but it's spelled differently. If you do that rest period, you end up with dough that is more extensible, meaning you can extend it out. So if you were making baguettes, you start out with a piece of dough, you're rolling it back and forth, and as you're rolling it, you're spreading it out further and further. If you have dough that's constantly fighting you, you're going to be there a long time shaping those baguettes. So he found out that if you let the dough sit for 5 minutes, the 5-minute rest period now is controversial. But if you mix the ingredients, let it sit, the water penetrates deeper into those two proteins that I spoke about, gliadin and glutenin. And with the water penetrating deeper into those proteins, before you knead the dough, you end up with proteins that allow you to extend the bread further out. So that rest period is nothing more than to give you dough that can be shaped easier. And when we shape bagels, we want it to be easier. We've done that. I'm going to start this back up and set a 3-minute timer. I'm going to put the mixer on speed 3. And I'm going to knead this dough now. So what's happening is those proteins are bumping into each other, and as they do, they start to stick together. You'll see that at the end of the 3 minutes, the dough will be much tighter in the ball. I'll show you what it looks like in the bowl. I have to switch the camera to show it to you. When this happens, that the dough comes out from underneath the dough hook, just stop the mixer. it back down into the dough. If it comes out again, do the same thing. If it's persistent, you can try slowing it down. I'm going to stop it one more time. This dough is insisting on escaping the dough hook tonight. I'm going to put this camera down and try one more time. Actually, I didn't have to try, it did it itself. So what's actually happening at the microscopic level is those proteins are bumping into each other. And as they do, they start sticking together. At the end of this process, you'll end up with dough that can be stretched. So you're going to do this for 3 minutes. Then you're going to put it in the refrigerator for an overnight fermentation. And when we get time later on, I'll tell you what's going on with that fermentation. And basically, that's what you're doing to develop flavor. Those of you that may have grown up with me or a little bit after me, you probably remember a product called Wonder Bread. And when you bit into it, you wondered where the flavor was because there was no flavor in that bread. And that's what we're trying to avoid by doing the overnight fermentation. So what happens next? I've taken this dough. This dough is now together. I can stretch it. I'm going to put this in a small container with a little bit of oil. I'm going to use a baker's spray, which is nothing more than an aerosol can of canola oil. I'm going to put the dough in the container, roll it around a little bit, turn it over so the top is nice and shiny. That means it picked up the oil from down below. And I'm going to put a piece of plastic wrap on it and then get it into the refrigerator for that overnight fermentation. And if you didn't have me talking, this whole process would have taken about 10 minutes. And that's how easy it is to make the bagel dough. Next, we're going to look at what does it take to make the actual bagel. I just want to clear my workspace real quick.
Bill, we have one question from someone watching and would like to know how many hours is overnight?
Well, we're mixing this at 7 o'clock. And I would bake this tomorrow morning after 7 o'clock. So that's 12 hours. 12 hours is more than enough time. So I just brought over the dough that I made yesterday, and before class started tonight, I divided it into 6 equal-sized pieces. You can see that this cut took two pieces. There's like 3 here. There's probably 3 or 4 here. The first thing I suggest you do, this is the pre-shaping step. The first thing I suggest you do is with your thumb, just push all those small pieces that you used down into the center. Then I'm going to grab opposite corners and pull them together and pinch them over the back. And what I'm doing is defining the top of my bagel. I'm taking the side with my fingers and I'm squeezing it. And as I squeeze the sides, I'm stretching this top. So this top is becoming nice and smooth. And all of the excess is being pinched together on the bottom of the dough, of the bagel. So it ends up looking like a head of garlic. I'm going to put it on the counter with the pinched ends down below. Doing the same thing with all 6. And right now, this is just plain bagel dough. Remember, I want the top to be as smooth as I can without spending all night trying to make it smooth. Pinch the ends together, put it down on the counter. This is called pre-shaping the bagel. There's that head of garlic, nice smooth top. I'll go as quickly as I can here. Nice smooth top. And Roz, if you'll remind me, we'll come back to that fermentation period later on in the discussion. Okay, so
Okay, sounds good.
I have 6 pieces of dough that have been pre-shaped. The next step is called the shaping process. In the shaping process, I'm going to use my middle finger and my thumb. I'm going to put, let me switch the camera real quick so you can see it up in the air. I'm going to use my middle finger and my thumb. I'm going to put my middle finger on the center of the top of the bagel. Remember, I predefined what the top was. It's that nice smooth part. I'm going to put my thumb in the center of the bottom of the bagel. I'm going to start moving my fingers back and forth until I can feel my fingertip. And when I can feel my fingertip, I'm going to really push those fingers back and forth so that the hole gets bigger, so that I can get 2 thumbs into this bagel. I'm going to use this section of my hand here, like this. I'm going to make this hole in the bagel at least 3 inches, which doesn't sound like most traditional bagels. And as I do that, I want to try to get the perimeter to be symmetrical because I want the bagel to bake evenly. So there's the bagel. It's a pretty big hole. Just try to smooth it out a little bit more. And I'm going to put it down and try to even it out as best I can with that 3-inch hole. I'm going to repeat that process now. When I can feel my fingers, I'm going to open this bagel up so that it's 3 inches and symmetrical going around. Nice and big. I'm going to switch the camera to my workspace so you can see what my hands are doing after I get done stretching it out. There are two primary ways of shaping a bagel. This is not the way that a professional bagel maker shapes a bagel. They make a rope, and then they wrap the rope around the palm of their hand or around the perimeter of their hand and roll the two ends together. I teach this class to both adults and children, and the children just can't, their hands aren't big enough to do that rope. So I do this way for everybody. It's just a little bit slower, but it produces a great bagel. So I'm just, after I put it down, I'm just trying to get the perimeter to be more symmetrical.
Bill, we have a question from someone, and she'd like to know, do you need to let the bagels come to room temperature before attempting this next step of forming them?
Yes.
Okay.
It's a difficult task if the bagel dough is cold. I recommend, the recipe tells you to take them out an hour, take the dough out an hour before you divide it. So I'm going to show you what they look like now. You can see this, the holes are getting smaller already. This one's even much smaller. That's just the natural process of the gluten pulling back and the bagel beginning to fill with air. I'm now going to set a 20-minute timer. And what we're allowing now is the bagels are going to be allowed to start filling up with gas because the yeast is still eating. Let me set that timer. I'm starting a pot of water on my stove to boil. And now we have 20 minutes to wait for these bagels to fill up with gas. And then we're going to go into the process of giving the bagels a bath. If there are any questions that you want to address now, this would be a good time. If not, I will explain the bath process, why we're using it. And I'll
Well, we do have a couple questions. One person would like to know, what makes a bagel chewy versus dry?
That's a wonderful question that's answered by the bath process. So let me explain the bath process now, and then we'll go on to the next question. I'm going to boil the bagels in a solution that has baking soda, salt, and honey. Leave the honey out of the discussion for a moment because that's a totally different conversation. But let's talk about the baking soda and the water. If you remember back when we were mixing, we added a product called diastatic malt powder. And I told you that the diastatic malt powder was not being used for flavor, because if you're looking for flavor, you would use non-diastatic malt powder. So buyer beware if you're going to buy malt powder for the purposes of what diastatic malt powder does. You don't want to buy non-diastatic malt powder because it won't work. Let's talk about what diastatic malt powder does and how it fits into the bath process. When you put a piece of bread dough or bagel dough into the oven, there are sugars that are naturally present on the outside of that dough, the bagel or the bread. And for those of you that were paying attention to the ingredients, somebody should say, wait a minute, Bill, we didn't put any sugar into this mixture. And you're right, we did not. I told you that the bag of flour was primarily starch and protein, but there are also a small amount of enzymes in there. When the enzymes get wet, the enzymes attack the starch. The visual of it I like to use is think of the starch as a candy bar with a wrapper. The enzymes take the wrapper off of that candy bar and present the candy to the dough. So the enzymes take the wrappers off of the starch and they break the sugars out of the starch. And it's important because yeast needs sugar to survive. It eats sugar. But those same sugars not only provide life to the yeast, they provide sugars for the outside of your product that can be caramelized and turn brown. So when sugars heat up, they caramelize, turn brown. When you put dough in the oven that has an altered pH factor, for those of you that remember from school, the pH factor told you if something was alkaline or acidic. We're going to add baking soda to the water, which makes it alkaline solution. And when you put a bagel with sugar on the outside into an alkaline solution, and you put that into the oven, it's like putting that browning process on steroids. That diastatic malt powder gives the enzymes that we spoke about extra energy. So the enzyme activity goes way up when you add diastatic malt powder. You end up producing more sugar. That's more sugar for the outside of your product. More sugar on the outside of your product with the heat of the oven in a alkaline environment. It just makes everything happen much faster.
Bill, we have a question from someone. Can you spell the malt powder that you're talking about? Can you spell the name of the product you're referring to?
It's dia, D-I-A, static, S-T-A-T-I-C. And be very careful with diastatic malt powder. I just told you that you put it into breads to get better crust. But if you put too much of it into breads, you get great crust with chewing gum inside. You have to.
It's something you can get at any grocery store, or and it's, yeah, where can you buy something like that?
I buy mine over the internet. I am told that you can buy it in the local brewing stores where you go to brew beer and wine. I've never tried to buy it there, but I'm told that's where you can buy it.
And is there any substitute if you can't find it?
Well, you can use things like honey to add more sugar, but all you're doing is adding more sugar. You're not increasing the enzyme activity and you're sweetening the product, but you will get a better crust with honey.
Okay, is this a good time for some more questions or no?
I want to go back to the bath process.
Okay.
And why the bagel is chewy. When you put a piece of dough in the oven, you've already have gas inside of that dough, whether it's a loaf of bread or a bagel. And one of the properties of gas is when you heat gas, it expands. So when you put a piece of dough in the oven, it starts to expand because the gas is heating up. The yeast continues to eat until the internal temperature of the product reaches 130 degrees, at which time the yeast expires and it stops producing gas. So if you put a piece of dough in the oven with viable yeast still inside, the bread will get even bigger because the yeast will continue to give off gas, the oven will continue to heat that gas, and it will continue to expand. We do not want a bagel that is nice and fluffy, light and fluffy. We want it to be dense. So what we're doing now is we're going to wait for 20 minutes for these bagels to pass what is called a float test, which means nothing more than if I put this bagel in a pot of cold water, it will float on top. That's the indication that is just the right amount of gas in there. And then I'm going to boil the bagel in the water, which will kill the yeast. So the yeast will die before it goes into the oven, and it will not be producing any more gas. So the bagel will not get light and fluffy, it'll stay dense, and it'll stay dense and chewy because when we give it a bath, we're actually putting some water into the starches, not a lot, but some, and it makes for a dense, chewy bagel. I said leave the honey out of the conversation. That's the honey that's in the bath water. There are two bagels available to you in the marketplace. One's called a New York style bagel, and the other is a Montreal style bagel. A New York style bagel is never made with honey in the water. A Montreal bagel is always made with honey in the water, but the two bagels use a different dough. I'm using a New York style dough, but I'm putting honey into it because I like what it does to the flavor of the bagel. So if you ever go to some party and tell somebody that you made a New York style bagel and you boiled it in honey and water, if they knew what they were talking about, they would tell you that you were wrong. It couldn't be a New York style bagel. You can argue with them and tell them that Bill said it is a New York style bagel. He just likes honey in the water, and that's why he used it. And now, Roz, we can take more questions.
Okay, let's see. Someone would like to know, if you want to add raisins or chocolate chips, when would you do that?
You do that, let's talk about raisins first. You wash the raisins and get them wet. And then you incorporate it. Remember, we did the kneading process for 3 minutes after we had the 5-minute auto lease. You add the raisins at the end of that 3-minute kneading cycle. You continue to run the mixer on speed 1 until most of the raisins incorporate, not all, but most. And then you hand knead the rest of those raisins in on your counter. If you ran the dough hook, allowing the raisins to fully incorporate, you would end up smashing the raisins too much. So you add the raisins at the end of the kneading process. The chocolate chips can be added at the beginning of the kneading process. You could actually add them at the beginning of the mixing stage. They're pretty durable and can take the mixing action without being destroyed. Okay?
Oh, okay, and let's see. Someone would like to know whether you have a class on how to make bialys.
I do not have a class on bialys. I'd be happy to put one together. I have had probably 3 requests this year. And the reason I don't make bialys is my wife can't stand onions. And to me, a bialy without onions would be sacrilegious. So
Okay.
I don't make them.
And we have a question from someone who would like to know, what if you don't have a mixer with a bread hook? What would you do?
Remind that person that bagels were being eaten long before electricity. So that's evidence that the dough can be mixed by hand. This is the best mixer you can have. So you put all those ingredients in the bowl and you literally just put your hands in and do this and squeeze the dough right out between your fingers. Just keep squeezing it until there's no more dry ingredients. Let it sit for 5 minutes and then knead the product by hand. Push down on the back of your palm and then fold the dough over, push down again, and just keep folding in different directions and pushing down with this part of both of your hands. And you'll come out with a bagel just as good as what we make tonight.
Okay, and someone would like to know, how many bagels does your recipe make? I see you made 6 tonight. Is that typical for your recipes?
Yes, this recipe will make 6 bagels the size of what you would buy at an Einstein bagel or a Panera bread. If you want bagels that are a little bit smaller, you would do everything the same except divide the dough into 8 pieces rather than 6. And the bagels will be a little bit smaller than what you're going to see tonight.
Okay, those are all the questions we have right now.
Okay, let me get some water out for the float test. And let me explain what what the boiling process looks like. I'm going to pick up one of my bagels, which is something that I don't recommend you doing at home. I've put it in the palm of my hand. This is the top of the bagel. That was the part that was always pointing up. I'm going to put 3 of these in the bath solution at the same time. I'm going to start by holding it so that the bagel is facing up. I'm going to go over to the water and I'm going to put it in the water face down, 3 of them. I'm going to let it boil for 1 minute. And then I'm going to flip it over. I'm using a soup skimmer to flip it over. Just push on the edge and flip it over. If you don't have a soup skimmer, you can use a slotted spoon. You just need something that will be able to lift the bagel out and allow the water to run off the bagel. The reason I put the bagel in face down, it boils for 1 minute. I flip it over, now it's face up. It boils for 30 seconds. And then I'm gonna go in with a harsh device. This is pretty harsh to the bottom of that bagel. And as I lift it up, if it marks the bagel, I really don't care because it's the bottom of the bagel that'll be marked. If I'm using a slotted spoon, that's even more harsh than this netting. There's a good chance you'll be putting some kind of a dent in the bottom of the bagel. So you boil it on 1 minute face down, flip it over, 30 seconds, go in with this, lift it out, and then put it on a cooling rack, and then put the other 3 bagels in, then transfer immediately from the cooling rack to a piece of parchment paper that you're going to use to load the bagels into the oven. I am baking my bagels on a pizza stone. I will show you, I'm gonna switch my camera. I'm gonna turn my camera off first. I'm gonna switch the camera around so that you can see what's going on at the stove and what's going on at the oven. Let me turn the camera back on and switch it. Okay, so you can see here I have a pot of water boiling. I have a towel over here that I'm going to put a cooling rack on. I have my salt, my baking soda, and some honey. Down in the oven, I have a pizza stone on that middle shelf, and I've been preheating this oven for about an hour to 450 degrees. I'm going to load my bagels on a piece of parchment paper on a pizza peel. Let me switch the camera back so you can see the pizza peel. Pizza peel, I'm going to put some cornmeal on here. And then I'm going to put an egg wash on the bagels. Put my seasonings on top, and then get these bagels into the oven. I'm running a little late, so let me try to get this process speeded up for you so you're not here all night. Let me show you the float test first. Put the bagel in the water and it floats to the top. I think you can see it floating there. So that's telling me that these bagels now have enough air that they can pass a float test so that they are ready to go into the bath. So I'm going to put in my baking soda slowly, my salt, my honey. I'm going to give that water a stir. Turn the heat back up. I'm going to bring the camera back over to the stove so you can see it. Okay, so you can see the bath solution now. Okay, I'm doing that boiling 1 minute with the top facing down. Just getting an egg wash ready. Remember, 1 minute face down, 30 seconds face up.
Bill, a couple people are asking about the egg wash. Can you use something besides egg on top, or is it necessary? A couple people have asked about that.
You don't have to use an egg. You could use water. If you're going to use, well, let me back up. The egg is used for 2 reasons. It provides color to the bagel. So if you substitute water, you're going to lose some color. You could use milk. You probably won't get a lot of color, but you'll get some. But it also provides glue for the seeds that you're going to put on the bagel. So if you use a substitute other than egg, you can get that same glue effect from another liquid. Okay, so here's the time is up. Taking these first 3 out. I'm going to get the next 3 in. Face down.
Bill, there's another question about the egg wash. Is it just the egg white?
You can use egg white instead of egg yolk. When you consider egg wash, there's 3 things to consider. You can do egg white, you can do the whole egg, and you can do just egg yolk. And of course, you can add water to any of those. Egg white will give you the least amount of color. Whole egg will give you a little bit more color. Egg yolk will give you the most color. I'm going to switch the camera around so that you can see the bagels being egg washed. I have to flip these bagels over. When you put the egg wash on, if you're using egg wash, make sure you get the sides as well as the top, because you want the sides to have the same color as the top. Tonight, I'm going to make 2 everything bagels. I'm going to make 2 sesame seed bagels and 2 plain bagels. So let me put on the everything seasoning first. I'll bring over the other 3 bagels.
There's some questions, Bill. What are you using? Are you using the whole egg, just the egg yolk? What are you using right now?
I'm using the whole egg. So I did the everything. This will be my sesame, and then I'll have 2 plain. I'm going to pop these in the oven and set a timer for 8 minutes. Okay, 8 minutes. And then I'm going to rotate them 180 degrees. And then it'll be baked for 8 more minutes, and then you'll be done. So 16 more minutes, if you can hang in there. If you want me to make the cream cheese, I'll be happy to make the cream cheese. If you want me to answer questions, I'll be happy to answer questions.
Okay, so people really are curious about the egg wash. Do you add water to your egg wash?
No, I do not on this case. My instructions to students is if you don't know why you're being told to do something in a recipe, you should probably do it, because you'll see recipes that tell you to use egg wash with water, and then you'll see recipes that tell you to use egg wash without water. And there's a good scientific reason behind the 2 decisions. So if you don't know why you're being asked to do it, you should probably do it. I do not use water in these. Water allows the product to expand more. It delays the caramelization of those sugars on the outside. I don't want to delay the caramelization of the sugars on the bagel. I want this bagel to be nice and tight. And if I used water, it would allow it to expand a little bit.
We have another question from someone who would like to know whether Bavarian pretzels and bagels are made the same way in a water bath.
They are made the same way. A good Bavarian pretzel requires a product that most of us would not want to bring into our home. And that is a food grade lye, L-Y-E. It's a very caustic to plumbing systems. And I don't think any of us want to take the chance of ruining the plumbing in our home, the drains in our home, by having lye in our home. I'm sure if you knew what you were doing with lye, you could use it in your home safely, but I choose not to bring it into my home. So if you use baking soda to make a pretzel, you'll get something that's similar, but it's not going to be a good, true Bavarian pretzel. It's not going to have.
Okay, so those are all the questions we have. So if you wanted to demo the spread, that would be great.
Perfect. Let me switch the camera again. The recipe for this spread is very simple. I'm using the disc in my food processor. I'm using 8 ounces of cream cheese. That's room temperature cream cheese. I'm using 1/4 of a red pepper, piece of celery, a carrot, 2 radishes, and 2 green onions that I'm going to slice up rather than put in the food processor. So let's start by turning the food processor on. Putting in the carrot, celery, red pepper, the radishes, that's it. So for those of you that were keeping track, I had celery, carrot, radish, red pepper, and now I'm going to slice 2 green onions into small pieces. Show you what I mean by small pieces in a second. Two green onions into small pieces. I'm going to add all of this to my mixing bowl. This is the carrots, the celery, the radish, the red pepper. Now I'm going to add the green onions. Just got some on the floor. I'll have to clean that up. I'm going to mix all of this together. Big piece of celery, I'll take that out. And now I'm going to add the 8 ounces of cream cheese. And I should tell you that this is a savory cream cheese spread. I do have other cream cheese spreads that you're welcome to the recipes on. They are not savory, they are more sweet. I make a honey almond cream cheese spread, and I make something that I call berry, the word berry twice. It's made with dried fruit berries that get rehydrated and then chopped into small pieces and then mixed with cream cheese. And if you do that, and you don't like the flavor of it, if you think it's too tart, then you just add honey and it sweetens the berry cream cheese spread. So all I'm doing now is mashing all of that chopped up vegetable in with my cream cheese. I'm going to add 2 more ingredients, and that is salt and black pepper. I'm going to use a considerable amount of black pepper. I think it's one of the ingredients that makes this a much better spread. A little bit of salt. I don't use a lot of salt in this house. I started on the pepper, but I'm being told to rotate the bagel, so I'm going to turn them real quick.
Bill, someone's asking, what's the oven temperature?
450 degrees. Put a little bit more pepper in here. And that is a wonderfully delicious vegetable cream cheese spread that goes extremely well on an everything bagel. It actually works on all of the bagels. As you get into the sweeter bagels, that's when you find the sweeter cream cheeses work better. I wouldn't want to put vegetable on a cinnamon sugar bagel. I don't think that combination would work well. I hope I didn't insult somebody just now, but it would not be my
Bill,
choice.
someone's asking about using a convection oven. Do you ever use a convection oven for baking?
I do not. The rule of thumb with a convection oven is reduce the temperature by 25 degrees and then try to keep the time the same. But one of the best ways of knowing if a baked product is done is an instant read thermometer. This is much more reliable than your eyes looking at the outside of the bagel or the bread. The instant read thermometer, most of the recipes that I have tell you what the internal temperature of the product should be. I've made so many of these bagels, I don't need to take the temperature anymore. I can't tell you how many times I've made bagels and taught this class. It's got to be close to 100. I've been doing this for 8 years, and I've taught a lot of bagel classes.
Well, we have a couple other questions. Someone would like to know, is the parchment paper in the oven or are the bagels directly on the stone?
The parchment paper is under the bagels on top of the stone.
Okay. And then we have another question that says, if you started working the dough at 7 a.m., at what time are you eating bagels, assuming you're not teaching at that time?
If I were to make a pumpernickel bagel, which I just did the other day, within 3 hours of starting the mix, those bagels are ready. If I were to make a chocolate chip bagel, they would be ready in 3 hours. Cinnamon raisin bagel, you could make that in 3 hours. It's the plain bagel dough that you want science to develop flavor, as opposed to the ingredients that you're using in the aforementioned bagels, the cinnamon raisin, etc. The role of an artisan baker is to develop many different flavors out of 4 ingredients, which are flour, salt, yeast, and water. And that's what an artisan baker does. He or she develops many different flavors by manipulating time and temperature, which is basically allowing science to do what it does inside of the bowl as the dough is fermenting overnight. So if you have a product that is loaded with flavor ingredients, you don't have that dependency per se on the dough going through the fermentation process. You're pushing flavor with the ingredients themselves. So you can make bagels much faster if you're making those flavorful bagels. If you're making plain bagel, I would really stress the overnight fermentation. The question came up before. 12 hours would be more than enough to develop flavor, but you can actually develop more flavor with more time. But now we're talking about subtle differences like being able to taste wine and determine where the grapes were grown. Most of us can't do it. So if you were to taste a bagel that fermented for 6 hours, 12 hours, 24 hours, I'm not sure that most of us would be able to differentiate the flavor of those bagels. But to an expert, they could. More questions, Roz?
No, we do have some nice comments though in the chat. So if you want to look at those people that really enjoy kind of the way you explain things, it's just different, I think, than most cooking classes are more or not so much about the science, and so you don't really understand, how and why things are happening.
Because most cooking classes are teaching you how to cook, and cooking is an art, and baking is a science. And when you understand the science, the more you understand the science, the more in control you are of the process and the flavor of and quality of what you are baking. So I stress, as I said in the beginning, I don't teach recipes. I teach good habits, and I teach the science so that you understand why you're being asked to do something, what will happen if you don't do it, and then you're equipped to make the decision. Do I want to do what I'm being told to do, or is there a good reason for me not to do it, and what impact that's going to have on my dough or on my product? A perfect example is you'll see recipes that will tell you to use room temperature water. Tonight we use 95-degree water. You'll see other recipes, they'll say 55-degree water, 45-degree water. And those waters are being used for specific reasons. I told you that when you put water into flour, the enzymes attack the starch. If you put cold water into flour, the enzymes attack the starch, but they don't wake up the yeast because the water is too cold. So when you use cold water, like 45-degree water, you end up with a dough that is subtly more sweet, even though you didn't change any of the ingredients. All you did was you started the enzyme activity so that the wrappers came off the sugar or the candy bars, but the yeast wasn't woken up yet, so they didn't start eating those candy bars. And when the yeast wakes up, there's more candy bars than the yeast can eat. And you end up with a product that is subtly more sweet. But now we're back into that area of being able to tell what region grapes were grown in. Not everybody can do it. But it does produce a different flavor.
Bill, someone would like to know, what's your favorite thing to bake?
The things that put smiles on everyone's faces. I get asked that question all the time. And the answer is, there's a lot of things that I really enjoy baking for a specific purpose. Let me get these bagels out and I'll explain that real quick. Let me get these up to the camera first so you can see how pretty they are. So there's your 2 plain bagels, your 2 sesame, and your 2 everything bagels. And they were all made with the same plain bagel dough. I'm gonna leave them on that sheet, on the cooling rack. I'm gonna take them off the sheet, so that they're on the cooling rack directly. Otherwise, they tend to get a little damp on the bottom as they cool. So what do I mean by I have many things that I like to bake? One of the meats that I enjoy eating in the summer is a bratwurst. There's nothing better to me than a bratwurst with one of the bratwurst rolls that I make specifically for bratwurst. I know some people would say, why in the world would you make a roll just for bratwurst? And the answer is because it's so darn good. And there are other things that I make that go real well with other things that we're eating. The summer's here now, so the chives are up in the garden. I love a pumpernickel bagel with fresh cream cheese and chives. I don't really care for a pumpernickel bagel in the winter if I don't have fresh chives, so I tend not to make them in the winter. So you see, there are things that I like to make because they go with other things that I am eating. I hope that answered your question.
Yes, it did. And there's lots of nice comments about how beautiful the bagels are. They really, truly are gorgeous, Bill.
And there was no hocus pocus. That really was an oven behind me. It wasn't a hole in the wall that I passed the dough out and somebody handed me bagels. That is how easy it is to make gorgeous, delicious bagels.
Now, that looks like the real deal, for sure. Yeah, no, we got through all of the questions, and I encourage you to everyone, to check out Bill's website, buildabaker.com, and there's a lot of information there with recipes. There's a tab at the top that says recipes, or he sounds like you can email him, and he'd be happy to answer your questions.
Absolutely. There's
So
the schedule there also. I don't believe there's anything on the schedule because I haven't posted July yet.
But I just want to thank everyone. Bill, thank you so much. It was so much fun working with you. We will do this again sometime. And everyone that joined us tonight, we really appreciate it. We hope you had a good time, and you definitely give this a shot at home.
Very good.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.